I'm gonna have my golf. Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and kick it off. So my name is Nick Lyos. I am a first-year MBA student at Yale SOM. I'm pleased to introduce our fourth session today, which is a chat between Emary Aronson, Chief Knowledge Officer and Advisor to the CEO of the Robinhood Foundation, and Professor Kate Cooney, a Senior Lecturer in Social Enterprise and Management at Yale SOM. Thank you both so much for being here, and please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to say a few more words of introduction, and then we'll get into our fireside chat, but we are going to reserve some time to engage with all of you as well. Emary Aronson, Chief Knowledge Officer and Senior Advisor to the CEO of the Robinhood Foundation. In this role, Emary engages on the organization's learning agenda and has overall responsibility for Robinhood's bespoke initiatives, including the Blue Ridge Labs, Robinhood's Learning and Technology Fund, and Mobility Labs. Founded in 1988, Robinhood is New York City's largest poverty-fighting organization, which finds, funds, and partners with programs that are proven to be effective remedies to poverty and a consistent force for good in the lives of New Yorkers. Emary also manages the Robinhood Relief Fund, which has now been activated for the third time in Robinhood's history. It was originally organized to address the needs of those affected by the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. The Robinhood Relief Fund was activated again after Superstorm Sandy, and a third time 18 months into the pandemic, when the COVID-19 Relief Fund raised and allocated over $82 million and gave over 1,000 grants to over 640 organizations to support the needs of low-income New Yorkers directly affected by the crisis created by COVID-19. Prior to her current role, Emary was the Chief Program Officer at the Robinhood Foundation and joined Robinhood in 1999 as the Managing Director for Education. So she has a long view of the work of the Robinhood Foundation. Emary holds a BA in History from Smith College, a Master's in Economic History from the London School of Economics, most importantly, an MPPM from the Yale School of Management, and a PhD in history from the University of Chicago. So we're thrilled to have you here with us today and excited to think with you, reflect back on the work that Robinhood has done and the lessons that are there for all of these impact investors, future aspiring impact investors, and the broader space of social entrepreneurship and social enterprise. So the Robinhood Foundation is an organization at the front lines of fighting poverty in the largest city in the United States. It's a city of about 8 million people, 300 square miles, situated in the largest metropolitan area in the world, with a gross metropolitan product of over $2.4 trillion. The Robinhood Foundation is known for its ambition in fundraising, in its quest for impact, and in the rigor with which Robinhood aims to measure impact and use data to guide investments. So I want to start there with the data and the measurements. There's many adages about KPIs, what gets measured gets managed, but also everything that matters can't be measured. Robinhood innovated the use of the BC ratio, the benefit cost ratio, where you have an approach to thinking about the volume of impact, relying on econometric research literature to develop proxies for value. Love to hear about what spurred the development of this benefit cost ratio and how over time you've evolved your approach to using the BC ratio to make decisions and garner insight into the work.
Well, both thank you for the question, but most importantly, thank you for including me here and having me here today. As we were just saying before, SOM didn't look like this when I was here, so it's great to be back in this space and to see how the school has evolved, which is also sort of a little bit of a parallel history of how Robinhood has evolved. I think we're not quite the same age, but not that far off. Robinhood was founded in 1988, came out of the crash of '87, which people thought was going to be the worst depression since the Great Depression, and that those who were going to be most affected were going to be low-income New Yorkers. And so the people from the business community thought, couldn't we apply the same principles that we applied to our for-profit giving? Couldn't we apply that to charitable giving? Couldn't we use those same business principles? Couldn't we use those same techniques? Which put us, as the organization was created, onto what became the leading edge of what would then be known as venture philanthropy. We did the same things that the venture capitalists would do in terms of, could we bring in evaluation? Could we bring in management assistance? Could we bring in all those supports? And this is sort of the roots of why we do a benefit to cost ratio, which is in those early years during the 90s, we actually would have every grant we made, we had an evaluation firm came and looked at it and did a bit of a study of it and tried to give us back data, because we always knew that data was going to be at the heart of understanding. We were seeing an evolution in the whole nonprofit sector, because earlier in time you would say, oh, nonprofits, they were doing God's work. They didn't need to have data, they didn't need to demonstrate anything because they were just doing good. And here's a group that says, oh no, they are doing good, but there is things we can understand, and data and measurement are important to understanding. And so we would have this evaluation firm come in, and we began to realize that we actually needed to be a little bit more rigorous than that. One of my favorite experiences, I arrived in 1999. There were 15 other people working at Robinhood, and we were doing about $4 million a year in grant making. We now have about 115 people, and we do about $130 million a year in grant making. And so, but I arrived to work in the K-12 education space, and I was given this evaluation and had a series of pie charts. And one of the pie charts was the gender of students in the school that was being evaluated. The only thing was, it was an all-boys school, and so they gave me a pie chart that was one color, right? Which to me, it didn't seem like evaluation. It didn't seem like useful data to have a pie chart that says that. So, so move forward a little bit, and 9/11 really changed everything about the way we worked and how we thought about things. And in post 9/11 world, we actually brought on a chief program officer who defined himself as our chief economist, and he said, there are a rigorous set of metrics that we can design for this. And he brought together some Nobel laureates, and over time evolved what we now have is about 170 algorithms to measure various effects of various interventions. So what is the value of a high school diploma? What is the value of being able to wash your hands every day? And we use them as they apply to the particular interventions that we are looking at. We know that they are, we look at them in terms of order of magnitude, rather than to say you can create a sense of false precision on this when you calculate it. We also spend a lot of time sort of saying what is genuinely Robinhood's contribution to this, so that we're not measuring, we're not giving $1 for something and taking credit for all of its accomplishments. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about it. I would say that the two of the crucial pieces of our benefit to cost ratios is that we look at both what is the counterfactual, what would have happened absent us, and then what actual proportion of budget were we, so what really was our contribution. Move forward a little bit more, and we've been well, first of all, we suspended our benefits to cost measurements during the pandemic because we weren't looking for that sort of data, and nobody was providing that sort of data. What we were looking for at that time was just how many people got food. Mm-hmm. You know, do people have enough money to pay the rent? And so as we're bringing them back, we're adding issues around mobility and how do we measure that. And also we're looking at what we are thinking about as mobility milestones. So it's, if our benefit to cost ratio rests on high school graduation or college graduation, what do we know about third grade performance in terms of reading? Because that's going to be a determinant. Mm-hmm. And I could keep going, but yes. You're allowed to ask a second question if you'd like.
So one of the interesting things about adopting this measurement approach is that, and we used to teach a case on the Robinhood Foundation at this particular moment, is that a whole set of organizations that you had been giving grants to all of a sudden became reorganized according to the benefit cost ratio. And I wonder if you could reflect on what were some of the surprising findings or some of the insights that you gleaned from moving from maybe a more anecdotal or softer approach to measurement than in that transition that changed maybe some of the decisions that in the current portfolio that you had at the time.
So one of the things that it really led us towards are funding things like mentoring, which doesn't have a huge return on one end, but is actually quite low cost on the other. Mm-hmm. And so if you're looking at a benefit to cost, you actually are getting a sizable benefit because the cost is quite low. The other piece that we're quite clear on is that we look at our benefit to cost ratios, but it's about, grant making is both art and science. And so we don't take ourselves out of this. We are known for being a very hands-on and being in the field. We talk about being boots on the ground. And so many organizations around the country will just call us or use us as their New York funder because you need to know what's going on in these programs. And I've had more than one experience of going into a classroom and saying, that teaching doesn't match these test scores, or saying in days when we kept things in file on paper, I'd like to see you're reporting this huge intake, but there's nobody in your waiting room, I'd like to see those files. And true story, they opened the file cabinet, they pulled out files, and the files were actually empty. So we cannot take being people out of this. There's sort of an adage that said, organizations don't fund organizations, people fund people. We'll also spend a lot of time, and I think that in a lot of investing, venture capitalists do this as well, you're betting on leadership. And so leadership isn't as easily measured in terms of saying, oh, we're going to have a number at the end of the day.
Yeah. I wonder if, given that, ESG, SROI, there's a growing number of attempts to try to use KPIs to measure social value and to measure the volume of impact. And having decades of experience now with experimenting and building on that idea that it can be art and science, is there something that you might have learned not to do when utilizing these kind of metrics-based approaches?
I think there are a couple of things we've learned not to do. One is sort of that false precision. There is no difference between a 10-to-1 and an 11-to-1. And how we got to 10-to-1 or 11-to-1 is fraught with probably some errors in there. So let's remember that. I always think about my late father was an engineer. He was a mechanical engineer, and when I was a kid, he taught me how to use a slide rule, and which I can't do anymore. I have no idea how to use a slide rule. And his argument was, well, when I was going to be on a deserted island, I was going to need a slide rule because my calculator would run out of power. And I would say, why am I bringing my slide rule onto this deserted island? Whole other question. But his argument was, and he taught engineering, and his argument was, my students need to know what the correct order of magnitude is, because they're building buildings, and if they punch a bunch of numbers into a calculator and they don't understand that the numbers are off, not whether they're off by 1 or 2, but they're off by a power or a factor of 10, this is going to fall down. And so I think that the same thing is true here. It's not whether it's off by 1 or 2, but is this more powerful intervention than that? And what we're still sort of struggling with is, how do I measure the power of an early childhood program against the power of a job training program for adults who are formerly incarcerated? And are there ways that we should think about that across, recognizing that there are errors that are introduced into all of our measurement? And that probably what we need at the end of the day is some sort of portfolio approach.
Mm-hmm. So sticking with that portfolio approach, one of the things that is interesting to reflect on is just the way the drivers of poverty change over time. And for an organization who's been at this since the late 80s, you think about Matthew Desmond's new book on poverty in America. Some of the statistics he cites, just since the year 2000, there's been an increase of 22% in evictions, increase of 19% in the number of families using food pantries, an increase of 74% in the number of school kids who report experiencing homelessness. So how do you respond over time to reallocating the portfolio in the face of an increased emphasis right now on housing and the role of housing and housing shortages in contributing to poverty dynamics?
I'm going to answer this in 3 different ways. So first is just to note something that's interesting about the Robinhood's model is we don't have an endowment. We raise all of our money every year. And so that we basically start each year at 0. We're on a calendar year, fiscal year. And what that means is that we tend to just give 1-year grants, which gives us a lot of flexibility. And we are in a position that we know that we would be, if we didn't raise another dime, we'd be able to work with organizations for 1 year to smooth the landing. But we are very close to this work, and so But we also know that all of these issues don't have one-year answers. And so we are constantly balancing what does it mean to be a one year at a time grant maker and what does the data tell us with how is it that we can actually move the needle, and how long should we stick with a group. So that's one part of it. Second part of it is we now have about a more than 10-year partnership with Columbia University where we have what they've called the poverty tracker. We've developed this poverty tracker. And so that instead of measuring poverty at a single point in time, fixed point in time, so it's a static measurement, they work with a fixed panel of 4,000 households in New York, and they interview or survey them every 3 months. So we have very dynamic data on what is happening. And so that while we know that the poverty rate usually hovers between 18 and 20% in New York, that if you looked over a 5-year period, a full 50% of New Yorkers will have spent a year in poverty. And so we are very conscious of that, and what does that mean for our work? And the other thing to note on that part is that for the first time in history, during the pandemic, actually the poverty rate dropped, and that was because of all of the supplemental programs from the government, the money to families and things like that. And so when you hear campaigns about extending the child tax credit or food stamps and all that work, it really had a huge impact. And it's sort of a shame that it's still a debate about what we should be doing. And I think I had a third part, but I'll come back to that one when I remember what it was.
Well, just to pick up on that last point, there's a graduate of SOM, Linda Mason, who started Bright Horizons Child Care Centers. And, that was a social enterprise, and she was really intervening in a space where she wanted to create highly academically rigorous early childhood ed opportunities right on site next to workplaces to allow more people to enter the labor force and give kids that kind of early academic head start. So it was a social enterprise intervention, intervening in an area where there was a gap. But at the same time, she's also very active, and she talks about being very active in the policy space to push for universal pre-K, which would put her out of business, but she's in it for that impact side of things. So I wonder if you could reflect on how Robinhood positions itself both in funding some of those social, entrepreneurial, nonprofit programs that step into that gap, but also pushing on the policies that could make a much broader, deeper impact if they were to be extended, things like the child care tax credit.
So over the last couple of years, we've actually intentionally developed a policy arm. So we have a staff that works specifically on policy issues and has spent, for those of you who follow New York politics, New York is now we're 21 days late on the budget, and so have been spent time doing that. We're also very much around how do we partner with government, how do we partner with city government in particular, because philanthropic dollars are just a tiny percent of the dollars that are out there. But there's really good work that you can do with philanthropic dollars, whether it's doing R&D for government, because we're much more nimble, and Robinhood in particular as a foundation is much more nimble and you can do some demonstration projects, and the idea being that government can then take it to scale. And so we can see it in a lot of different places that we can talk about along the way, but in places like college completion, and what are the programmatic supports that you need to help students complete. Or we had this really great project where we worked with homeless shelters, early childhood program, and programs for maternal depression none of which tend to work in the same space. And so the idea is New York City, the face of homelessness in New York is about families. And every year, about 1,800 babies are born to moms living in shelter. And so what we thought was, could you bring all those services into the shelters so the shelters could spend their time thinking about how do you place into permanent housing. Right now, the average stay in a shelter is pushing towards 500 days. And so you have children who will start school never having been stably housed. But government, the city was our partner at the table. We could do it because we could be the connective tissue. We don't have to fund categorically. Government tends to fund very categorically. And so, and then the benefit costs on that, you can do all the math underneath that to show how, and that flexibility becomes really important. And so really appreciate it. And we also always look at Bright Horizons and how they filled this space. But can I ask you back the question, since you teach this, how is it that you think about how much we should be measuring and how we should use those measurements?
Well, one of the things that I think the students love and that the faculty love about being in the university setting is we're a real crossroads, right? So we are a place where, especially SOM as a business school, we get the perspective of leaders from the public sector, leaders from the social sector, and from the business sector. And it's also a crossroads of new ideas, right? There's a lot of people coming through who want to speak to the students, who want to pitch their ideas to the leaders of tomorrow. And so it's a place where students can think critically about these trends that they will be immersed in the work of once they leave school. So in the classes that I've taught, we get really excited about models like Robinhood because you give us some really technically rigorous ways to dig into how you would do this work, and the students would calculate these robust SROIs and get into the weeds. And so loved learning those techniques, but also having the opportunity to think critically about what's fragile about these, what moves them, how is it the denominator or the numerator that can make this a high SROI, and what are the limits of this kind of tool. And so well beyond a particular skill, I think what they take away from their 2 years here are just ways to critically assess how and when you can apply these kinds of thinking. And these days, a lot of talk is about the no strings attached giving. And so I wonder how Robinhood is engaging with some of those new trends. We have people like Mackenzie Scott giving quite large grants to the organization and letting the leaders decide how to allocate, so not program, but organizational level funding. We have our own Andrea Levere, another SOM grad, really pushing this idea of enterprise capital, where you're investing in entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, and letting them pivot and allocate funding. And we hear from folks like Jason Price right here in New Haven with the Next Haven leadership team, experiencing funders across the spectrum, some who are asking for very specific program outcome measures and some who are willing to take those bigger bets. How are you navigating those waters?
No, it's a great time to be in this world because you see all of that. And I would add another section, which is talking about participatory grant making,
yes.
Right, which is something that we sit at this intersection of, we feel we're the stewards of other people's money. And so with that comes responsibility. I have a small story about that that I'll do a little detour on, which is this happened after 9/11, but it could have happened at any time. We got a letter from a mom who said that her child, her 5-year-old, had heard what had happened in New York, and he too wanted to help. And so he had gone into his room and he had taken his piggy bank and he broke open his piggy bank and he handed his mother all the money he had in the world. And he wanted her to send it to us to help. And then he signed the letter in his 5-year-old hand, and taped to the bottom of the letter were 3 quarters, because that was all the money he had in the world. And if somebody gives you all the money they have in the world, there are 2 things you know about that. One is that you have to be really responsible about what you do with it. And the second is he didn't really want us to sit and hold it for years and years while we decided what to do with it. And so what he was really thinking about was, there's a child in New York who's suffering, and I can help, and so I want to help. And that really is something that stayed with me all these years, but it's something that motivates us as well. And so I think that there's room in this world for all of those different types, in that when you come to a Robinhood, you come because we're going to bring some expertise to create an added value to how you're doing it. And as somebody who sits on the board of nonprofits, yeah, would love the Mackenzie Scott money, because who does it? They're also very large grants, and it's really helpful to have that flexibility. And we do a mix. Some of it's project oriented, some of it is general operating. I will say we once did general operating to a big group of schools, and when we got the report, they said, well, we used it to buy iPads for our faculty. I'm like, yeah, I'm not quite sure that that's what we had intended. You know who we are. And so sometimes we try to make sure that it's framed in the correct direction. It's not so wide open that's not. But it's also, we have a tech incubator and accelerator, and because of that, we have a tech user group. But our user group is made up of low-income New Yorkers for whom poverty is a lived experience. And so part of that is now not just working with that user group to think about it as how to work with the tech incubator, but how do we engage with what we refer to as our design insight group, or DIG, how do we engage with them in a way to inform all of our work? And so how do we hear from people for who are experiencing this about what the right strategy should be? And so to my mind, for Robinhood, that really getting down to the community level, plus having a system of metrics to partner with it, that's actually where the future is going to go. I don't think we're going to go to either extreme of just all general operating or participatory grant making, where we turn the money over to somebody else to do.
Mm-hmm. One last question, and then I'm going to take a round from the audience. One of the things that a scholar, Alnor Ibrahim, writes about is, there's been a lot of pressure on individual programs to create these robust outcome measures. And one of the things that you've done that I think is exemplary, and the things that Ibrahim in his work calls for, is for funders who have a bird's eye view on the sector to themselves fund important studies that can teach the sector as a whole something that then can move the sector forward, rather than having lots of individual programs trying to mount the kind of rigorous outcome studies that would really inform their practice. And you recently told me about an initiative like that around cash. You want to talk about that intervention?
This came out of a lot of our COVID work. We did $83 million. About half of that went in terms of cash assistance to individuals, and it was all the people who couldn't get money from the government. They were not documented. They were returning from incarceration, and so it was very long. It was very difficult for them to receive dollars, and because in this world, what happens is you got those dollars in by debit card, more or less, and we paid for the fees on them so that the person actually received the full value of it. And so, but a lot of organizations then started doing studies about, because now you could see how the money was being used, not in a bad way, but in a good way. And so we know that the majority, it went for rent, it went for food, it went for childcare, it went for oxygen, because everybody who we were working with was somehow COVID affected. And there was a big national program where about 32 organizations that were working with people who were being released from incarceration across the country. We provided this sort of cash assistance at a slightly larger level, and that was heavily studied by MDRC, with very strong results in terms of a reduction of recidivism. And what the final results of this is now emerging is that the state of California has created a cash assistance pool for those who are being released from incarceration. Not everybody gets it, but there's a subset that's getting it, and they took this study and said, and created a $50 million pool for the first time to say what would happen if instead of releasing people with, in New York terms, a Metro card, but actually release people with a little bit of money to get started, and to what would that do to recidivism? And they're seeing those early results, which is it reduces recidivism. Can I just loop back for one moment? The one thing that I wanted to say before was one of the changes that I've seen, particularly over the last few years, that we cannot talk about poverty in America without talking about structural racism, and that it is interrelated to everything that we do. We saw it so clearly during COVID, which shone a bright light on all of our broken systems, but there was no explanation of why people of color were dying at twice the rates of whites. And so it has to be part of every conversation, whether it's redlining, which has determined what housing is, which is therefore determined what schools are. It is in every part of the work, and that's very much came in the post George Floyd murder.
Yeah. All right, I want to take a round of 3 questions, and I think that's all we're going to have time for. So we'll just take 3 in a row, and then we'll turn it back over to Emary. I'll wait for the mics. There's some over here.
It's a very bright light.
Hi, thank you so much for all your comments and all the helpful content. I am a part-time student at Columbia University, but also I'm an ESG researcher. And a lot of the work that you do and a lot of the amazing impact that you create seems that is backed by a lot of data and a lot of models. And I feel like at this conference, but also at work on the private side, we constantly talk about the lack of social data, right? And how much it's difficult to move funds, especially from companies like mine in the private sector, towards social projects compared to environmental projects because of the lack of data, right? And so you do a lot of work that can also be linked to impact work, right? I know it's philanthropy, but there is a lot of impact that gets generated through your work. You talked about all the amazing work that you do with government. So in my role, I can see a lot of funds that can be moved by partnering with like foundation like yours in creating strong KPI to stimulate investments. So I wonder, how much work do you do with the private sector or private institution beside the government work? Because I think there can be a good opportunity to bridge some gap and move some capitals also from the private side that keeps, saying there's not enough social data, a lot of social studies to move those money. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll just take 2 more questions, and then we'll have to wrap.
Hi, my name's Amy. I'm a second-year MBA student at Yale. Thank you for your time. Way back at the beginning of your talk, you used the phrase about counterfactuals for how you prefer. I was wondering if you could expand on what kind of guidance and coaching you would give organizations as they might need to communicate counterfactuals. I'm running the Yale conference on mental illness next Friday here, which I hope many people come to. But as we were talking with funders, people said to us, well, what will happen if we don't fund you? And I found that a bit challenging because at that point in the planning process, we didn't yet know exactly every line item or every cost that we had and what we would do without it. So it was hard to communicate value at the outset of requesting funding. So I'm just wondering what you do to help organizations who might need help but not know necessarily how to convince you of it in that counterfactual manner. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. Nope. All right. We are over time anyway, so I'll let you have a 30-second.
Very quickly, we actually partner, most of our funding, actually almost all of our funding comes from the private sector. So in response to how do we work with the private sector, we are fully funded by the private sector, and so spend a lot of time also in conversation, therefore, with what is it that we're trying to do and why is it that they should be funding us. There are things that are much harder to explain and to have the data for, where we're trying to make these neat little daisy chains to show how it works. Things like, how do you measure hope? How do you measure power and autonomy or sense of belonging, which goes into an expanded definition of what is mobility. Appreciate it, but we found that that partly because of pressure from staff, from employees, companies actually want to partner because people want to be able to engage in this way. And in terms of counterfactual, quite quickly, we get to use. We don't make the organization tell us what the counterfactual is. We do that ourselves, and that we can do from publicly available data in terms of, how many people didn't graduate, how many people normally graduate high school in the same community that you're in. And so in terms of what's the counterfactual on a conference, that's a little bit more complicated to do. But I would love to talk to you because we've done a lot of funding around mental health for children and adults, and doing some of that data is really hard to do.
Yeah, and we'll also just say that all of Robinhood's algorithms are publicly available, and all 170 something metrics you can look up, and they're great to build on. Yeah. So the field begins to talk in the same language. But please join me in thanking Emary Aronson for being here, and a great conversation.
We get to go down the runway.
We'll just need to set the chairs.